Hi, everybody, and welcome to our webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. All right, so before we get started, I do want to introduce myself. My name is Adina Glincher, and I am the Senior HR Services Advisor here at PayEntry. If you have any questions about the content of the webinar today, feel free to reach out to our team. You can reach us at our email address, hrservices@payentry.com, and we are happy to address any questions you have. If you have questions for your attorney, we are not attorneys, so we ask that you do reach out to them directly. And then before I forget to mention, there is a handout section of the webinar today, so you will see one handout in there. It is just a copy of the slides, so if that makes it easier for you to follow along, or you want to print it out afterward to remember what we talked about, you are welcome to do so. And we will have a poll over halfway through the webinar today, and we'll ask for some participation. All right, and then lastly, if you have any questions that you would like us to address at the end, we usually have time for a Q&A, so feel free to type those questions into the question box. Okay, now that we got all that fun stuff out of the way, let's go ahead and get started on our topic for today. Today, we are discussing how to prepare your PTO policy. So we've been getting a lot of questions about your rights as employers when it comes to PTO, and we're going to cover a lot of the commonly asked questions we've been getting today in our webinar. And it's not as simple as it may seem. I know it used to be a little bit more simple, but a lot of regulations have updated and changed, so we want to make sure that everybody knows what those look like. So we're going to discuss what PTO is, the different types of PTO. We're going to discuss pros and cons of the different kinds. We're going to talk about developing a PTO policies, and we're really going to dig into the intricacies of a PTO policy. We're probably going to cover a few things you haven't thought about including in yours, so definitely get ready to take notes if you're interested in that section. And then we're going to cover PTO laws and compliance, and we're going to go over a few some general best practices. Is PTO right for your business? We'll see. And then we are going to discuss unpaid time off as well at the end of the webinar. And lastly, like I mentioned, we will end with a Q&A as long as time permits. All right, so what is paid time off, often referred to as PTO? It is an employer-provided benefit where an employee is allotted an amount of paid time off, which may be used at the employee's discretion. Now, there's some caveats to that, and we will discuss them. A PTO policy may combine all types of leave together under one general policy, which allows employees to use the time they need for sick leave, vacation, or maybe some other personal need. Employers can choose to either front load an annual allotment. So let's say you're going to give your employees 3 days. You can give it to them at the beginning of the leave year. Or you can allow your employees to actually accrue PTO based on time worked, which is a very common practice. And then a company's PTO policy establishes the guidelines that determine when and how an employee may use their PTO. So let's talk about the three biggest differences on the three major types of PTO. So we have traditional paid time off. The traditional paid time off system provides employees a specific number of days or hours they can use and breaks that time into separate categories. In your organization, you may refer to it as vacation and sick leave buckets. Maybe you have a personal leave bucket or a personal holiday, etc. Many employers increase the amount of time an employee receives in each category as the employee's tenure with the company increases. The longer you work for us, the more time we will give you to use. Then we have something called a PTO bank, and there are a lot of names for these, so if you've heard it called something else, it's likely the same thing. A PTO bank system combines all the days an employer would provide to an employee for things such as vacation, sick leave, and personal leave, even holidays sometimes, and puts it into a pool of total paid time off hours. So maybe instead of giving your employee 3 sick days and 5 vacation days and 2 personal holiday days, etc., you're going to say you get 2 weeks a year, use it as you need. The PTO bank does not distinguish how the employee can use their available time. Instead, it shows only the total number of hours the employee has available to use. And then we have this bucket that is fairly newer compared to the other two, and it's the unlimited PTO, sometimes called discretionary PTO. Unlimited PTO does not set a limit to the number of days or hours an employee can actually take off. And these are, like I said, becoming more and more common. Instead, these systems allow employees to take time off when they need to for any reason, as long as their time off does not impact their work or disrupt the business needs. So very flexible in that last bucket. All right, so let's talk about the pros. Traditional paid time off allows employers to set aside different policies and parameters for each category of time off. So you may be more lenient with your vacation or more strict with your sick leave or your personal time. It's up to you. You can have different policies, different accrual schedules, or they can look a lot alike. It's often easier to ensure compliance with state regulations related to sick leave when the policies are separate. So I'm going to pause for one moment. If you operate in a state where paid sick leave is required, and if you're not sure, we are going to talk about that today, then it can be difficult to do one PTO bucket. And the reason why is because the regulation requires that sick leave oftentimes be used for certain reasons, that maybe that you're not allowed to ask for documentation, or you're not allowed to write your employee up, etc. If they use that sick leave because it's protected time. So when we put it into different categories, we can more easily control each separate thing. The second, the PTO bank, a big pro is that it allows your employees to utilize their time off as they see fit. Maybe it doesn't matter to you what they're using the time off for, as long as they stick to their 2 weeks or whatever number you decide on. It can be easier to administer and track for the same reasons, and reduces the time leadership spends managing their employees' time off. We're not asking as many questions. They need a day, they get a day. And then we have the unlimited PTO. So a pro of this is, one, it's becoming more and more common and allows employees to take time off at the company's discretion. It's often seen as more flexible. And in today's day and age, it is so crucial to be competitive in this market. And so people are definitely starting to adopt this. In addition, it can provide an increase of time off to employees, which may be a benefit to them. Instead of keeping them at the 2 weeks, that example I keep using, or the 1 week, they can use as much time as they need, as long as it's not disrupting your business. So now we're going to move on to the cons. So with a traditional paid time off policy, it can be a greater administrative burden because we have different buckets. So we're having to keep track of different amounts. It also requires separate policies for each bucket. Rather than writing one complex PTO policy, we're going to be writing 2, 3, maybe even 4 different policies. Now, our team can help you with that. We do have templates for all of these policies included in our HR services packages, so don't let that overwhelm you too much if you're interested in our service. There's also some free templates out there. A con to the overall PTO bank is that all state-specific sick policy requirements must apply to all time off, which can prohibit disciplinary action from occurring. So as I mentioned on the previous slide, when we turn everything into one bucket and your state has requirements for sick leave, we then generally have to follow the rules of sick leave for all time off. So like I mentioned, maybe we can't really question our employees as to why they're taking the time off. Maybe we need to reinstate some of that time off if they're rehired. So definitely something to consider. Employees may be reluctant to take PTO when they are sick so that they can save it for their vacation. And with everything going on, the last thing we want is employees coming into the office when they're sick. So something to keep in mind. Another con is that some states require certain types of time off be paid out. And when we say paid out, we generally mean at time of separation. So whether they were voluntary or involuntary terminated, at the time of separation, some states require that you pay out PTO. If you put it all in one bucket, you are definitely going to be increasing that overall payout. And then we have the unlimited PTO. And the biggest con to this is Even though you would think, your employees could take as much time off as they want, employees are actually less likely to take time off with unlimited PTO policy. The reason being is it's not assigned to them. So it's not Sarah's or Josh's PTO bucket. It's just an unlimited policy that they're able to use. So employees are actually less likely to use it. And it's another, and I would say it can be a con, but not necessarily, is you definitely want an attorney to help you write these policies. The verbiage regarding the integration with leaves must be written very carefully so that we're not having to pay our employees the entire time they're out on a leave of absence. And some other verbiage can get quite intricate. So it's important that we do get some legal advice for those policies. All right, now let's talk about developing a policy. To develop a policy, begin by considering the state or states you do business in and whether they have any laws associated with them, such as time off, sick leave, or vacation. Consider whether you have a preference as to how your employees use their PTO. Maybe you don't care. You just want to give them their time. Maybe a big PTO bank would be best. If you are developing a new policy and a different policy is already in place, be mindful about addressing the employee's existing available time off when transitioning to the new policy. So you're not stuck in your current ways. If you heard of something maybe today that we talked about and you want to switch to it, that's absolutely an option. But it's important that we're not taking away already accrued time off from our employees. So definitely talk with your HR advisor or your internal HR manager if this is something you're interested in to avoid liability. Of course, consider the intricacies of the policy, which we're going to dig into on the next slide, and consider how you're going to track PTO earned and used to ensure adherence with applicable record keeping and notice requirements under laws and regulations where applicable. All right, so let's dig into the intricacies. We have a few slides on this. So first and foremost, determine what your PTO policy may be used for. And we bring up state laws quite a bit here because they are important to remember through this process. Who is going to be eligible? You are not legally required to provide PTO or vacation to your employees. I know that's a common misconception. So if you want it to only be eligible to your full-time employees or maybe to all regular employees, so everybody but your temporary employees, that's an option for you. So definitely consider that. Now, we're not talking about sick leave or a state regulation. We're talking about PTO in general. When will they be eligible? Are they going to be eligible immediately upon hire, after the introductory period, maybe after a year? How will PTO be calculated? Will it be according to their work anniversary, maybe a calendar year or a fiscal year? Will the amount of PTO received each year be based on length of service? So are we going to give everybody in our company the same amount of time off, or are we going to increase time off the longer they've worked with us? Increasing time off the longer they've worked with us is a great retention strategy. Oftentimes I'll see clients do it maybe when somebody hits like their 5-year mark, they get an extra week or an extra few days. So they really have to work for the company for quite a few years to get a retention kind of benefit, I should say, excuse me. Will your PTO be provided in a lump sum, also known as front-loaded, or accrued on a predetermined schedule? How much PTO will people accrue? Consider implementing a cap or a maximum accrual amount. And we could talk about, if you have specific questions, what a reasonable amount is. Generally, the standard is about 1.5 to 1.75 times the annual accrual amount should be the maximum. And when we say maximum, that means that employees can't carry over PTO beyond that amount. And if they hit that maximum amount, they either are paid out for it or they stop accruing PTO until they use some, which is allowed. When will eligible employees be allowed to begin using PTO? So we talked about when they'll become eligible, but when will they to start accruing? But what about using? They could be different dates and they could be the same. How far in advance must PTO be requested? When possible, of course, emergencies do happen. How will the company handle multiple requests for the same time off? This is very important to put in writing. It helps to prevent any type of favoritism claim because it's very clear if you have multiple people requesting time off for the same date, then whatever you predetermined is going to be how you decide who gets that time off. Is there a minimum increment of hours or days employees must take time off in? A lot of times we see you must take time off in 1 hour increments or 2 hour increments to avoid people requesting 15 minutes off. Outline the integration with leaves of absences and how leaves of absences may affect accruals. Will they stop accruing PTO when they're all on leave? Will they be able to utilize some of their PTO if they're out on an unpaid leave? Establish some carryover provisions, and of course, consider state regulation. So are they allowed to carry over PTO year to year? Or do they use it or lose it? And we'll talk about use it or lose it policies as well. Consider payout provisions in lieu of carryover. Of course, consider state regulations here as well. So if you don't want to allow your employees to carry over, maybe you pay them out at the end of each leave year. Establish what will happen to PTO at time of separation. Will they forfeit their PTO or will they be paid out? And this, my assumption is your decision on this will entirely depend on the state you operate. But you can always be nicer than your state regulations. We know this. So if your state requires that you forfeit it, you can absolutely pay it out to your employees as long as you're consistent. How much PTO may be used in a single leave year? Yes, you can cap that. Clarify your documentation requirements. Will you allow for reinstatement of leave upon upon rehire? Do you operate in a state where that is a requirement? And then ensure you have a retaliation statement included in your policy that says that the company is not going to retaliate against employees for requesting or using time off. So let's talk about this use it or lose it option I brought up. So use it or lose it is exactly what it sounds like. That's no fancy name. It forces employees to use their accrued paid time off before a certain date, usually the end of the leave year. If they don't use it, they lose it. Accrued paid time off that is left unused expires and is forfeited. Federal employment law does not forbid this, but a few states prohibit this, including California, Colorado, Montana, Nebraska. In these states, accrued but unused PTO is generally considered a form of wages and likely must be paid out upon separation of employment. Now I'm going to pause for one moment. If you are in one of those states or another state that may prohibit it, there are sometimes sick leave regulations that allow for use it or lose it. So right now we're focusing on PTO as a whole bucket. We're not focusing on the separate bucket. So in some of those states, if you have sick leave and you front load it, you are allowed to have a use it or lose it policy. But right now we're focusing on PTO only. PTO is looked at as wages. And then there are many states that expressly permit such policies, such as Illinois, Kansas, Louisiana, Maine, Massachusetts, New York, and Oklahoma. Employers in these states must provide their employees with reasonable notice of these use it or lose it provisions so that your employees have plenty of time to use their PTO balances. And it's definitely recommended, if not even required in some of these states, that you are notifying your employees of this in writing. This should be in your handbook and in your PTO policy. All right. So most states do not have laws or regulations that permit or forbid use it or lose it policy. So if I didn't mention your state already, it's probably because you're in this middle ground. In these states, employers are free to implement one as long as you are notifying your employees. And you'll see the states listed on the side. All right, so we're going to stop for one moment and we're curious, out of everybody on here today, do you have employees in a state with specific paid sick leave provisions? Go ahead and just click yes or no. And if you're not sure, absolutely, that's okay. It gives us a good gauge of what we need to talk about in maybe some of our future webinars. When we talk about state provisions, just so everybody knows, we care, yes, where your company is headquartered, where your offices are, but we also care about those remote employees, so don't forget about them. If they sit and work in a state that is not where your office is, you do need to follow the state that they are working in's regulation. So keep that top of mind as well. All right, I'm going to give it just a few more seconds. We're waiting for some more participation. All right, now let's see a couple more coming in. Oh, people woke up. We'll leave it up for a couple more seconds. All right. Now let's see what you all said. So 22% of you said, yes, absolutely, this is something we need to consider. 44% of you said, nope, we don't even need to worry about it. Great, then pick whichever policy works best for you. And then 33% of you are unsure. Thank you so much for sharing that. It can be incredibly confusing. So if you're not sure if you have employees in states where paid sick leave is even a thing, reach out to our team. We're happy to share that general information for you. And if you need more assistance as to the details of the regulation in that state, or you really want help implementing this PTO policy, we are happy to talk to you about our packages here at PayEntry. All right, wonderful. And it shows us that we should probably do a few more state-specific webinars. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what state leave laws apply to your organization and who within your organization they apply to. So as I mentioned, state leave laws can apply where the employee performs the work. Now, generally, and when I say generally, purposely, because generally it's where your employee sits and does their work. That's the state law we need to follow. Now, there are times where other states are going to want a piece of the pie, we call it. If your employee is working in many different states or traveling, it's going to depend on how much time they spend in those states. And of course, every state is different. So definitely consider if your employee is traveling regularly outside of their home base. This may differ from the office location as mentioned, and hybrid and remote workers can also be subject to different leave laws. Some reasons for use. Generally, this leave is used to care for yourself or your family member. Some states have expanded well beyond this, so they've included other people or other reasons. And allowable uses include care for an employee or covered individual due to a communicable disease exposure, donating or caring for someone who donates bone marrow or organ donation, bereavement, or to care for a child with a qualified health condition or disability. Now, PTO laws and compliance. So the following states have sick leave laws to consider. So if you are one of those 33% who said you weren't sure and you have an employee or an office in any of these states, then it's important that you consider those paid sick leave laws. And as a reminder, there is a copy of the slides in the handout section. So if I go a little too quick for you, definitely refer back to that. Now, the following state localities have sick leave laws to consider. Some of these you'll see are duplicates from the slide before, and some of them are brand new, but the entire state doesn't have a law, it's simply the locality that does. So if you operate or have employees in any of these localities, definitely consider those paid sick leave laws when implementing your PTO policy. All right. Now, implementing a PTO policy and keeping paid sick leave requirements top of mind is crucial. As I mentioned, employers must meet all the requirements for all the states that their employees are performing work within the company. It's beneficial for remote, hybrid, and multi-state employers if the policy covers all state requirements. And this can be really difficult at times to have one policy that covers all the states you operate in. Generally, our team can help you with this. We're not attorneys, as I mentioned, so we can't guarantee legal compliance of any policies we help write, but we can definitely give our HR guidance and opinions. And what we will recommend in these situations is that you apply the most generous policy to all of your employees, regardless of state. And then we'll go through each individual state paid sick leave requirements to make sure that each state regulations are covered. It can be a bonus for employees in states with no leave laws or leave laws with less generous offerings if you choose to do one for everybody. Make sure to consider any notice requirements in written policies. And remember, you can always be more generous than the law requires. Now, some things to consider include the amount of time off, accrual rates, and any caps you want to put in place. PTO must be available to use for the same reasons as paid sick leave if you're going to do this one big bucket. And you must follow the same conditions as statutory paid sick leave laws. And those may include PTO policies requiring manager approval and allow denial of PTO based upon discretion of the company will likely not comply with paid sick leave laws, because when somebody's sick, regardless of the fact that you have a business to run, we can't deny them their time in these protected states. Waiting time for new hires to use PTO and accrual of PTO is something to consider. Waiting times vary based on paid sick leave regulations. Of course, documentation, employee notice, no retaliation provisions that come with paid sick leave now apply to PTO, and we really shouldn't be retaliating against our employees no matter what. So hopefully that's not a big one. And of course, proper rate of pay and timing of pay. We don't want any wage and hour claims. So let's talk about some best practices. Some of these we mentioned already, some of them we haven't. Create a flexible PTO policy that works for your business and your employees. And like I mentioned, that might change over time, and that's okay. Make your PTO policy clear and understandable. Create a policy based on your company culture. Offer incentives or benefits within your PTO policies, such as rollover option or payout options. And consider offering opportunities for personal time off, such as volunteer work or professional development. I know that's one incentive I always love seeing as an employee. It amazes me when a company will provide me paid time off to volunteer. I think it just shows how invested they are in their community, but more on incentives next week or in 2 weeks. And then consider asking your employees what their preferences related to PTO. It's never a bad thing to include our employees in these conversations. So is PTO right for you and your business? Some questions to consider. Where is your business located? We've talked a lot about state, localities, etc. So consider where your employees are working before committing to a certain kind of plan. How flexible do you want your policy to be? Are you able to approve time off immediately, or do you need to consider staffing and business needs prior to doing so? Are you having issues hiring and retaining talent, kind of like the rest of the world? Well, then consider adjusting your current PTO policy. All right, unpaid time off. So we really wanted to include this slide because I will say that out of all the questions we get on PTO, probably 80% of them are, I have an employee and they either used all their time off and they're still requesting time, what do I do? Or I have employees who are requesting unpaid time off, they want to save their vacation time. Let's talk about it. Employers can choose to develop an unpaid time off policy to support employees with more flexibility. Hint, you can choose to, you don't have to. Unpaid time off is not compensated by the employer and is taken for a short period of time. Once you decide to include unpaid time off in your company, you need to define the process that employees must follow. Consider the following points. Is there also a PTO, so a paid time off policy in your company? If so, consider creating a separate time off policy for this unpaid time. Which employees or workers have access to unpaid leave? How many unpaid days off can an employee enjoy? And what is your leave request process? Now, I want to touch on some consequences of a vague PTO policy. After hearing our webinar today, let's say you think, you know what, I don't need all this information. I'm just going to keep my policy as is. This is way too complicated. Well, if you don't already have a detailed policy, some consequences of the vagueness can be that it may lead to inconsistent practices, which of course can increase your liability as a company. Claims of favoritism and or discrimination are likely to increase if time off is approved for some employees and not others, if some people need to provide you a notice and some don't. And failure to disclose how PTO integrates with leave of absences can cause potential wage and hour or discrimination claims as well. Failure to set a maximum accrual cap can result in a large payout that the company may not have accounted for financially. Including a notice requirement for requests will help prevent scheduling issues. And setting a minimum increment that PTO must be taken in will allow for ease of timekeeping administration. So there's a lot of pros to having a detailed policy, and this is one where we recommend you do it. And remember, you are in control. So aside from paid sick leave regulations in some states, you get to decide whether to offer vacation or PTO. There is no law that prevents you from requiring employees to use vacation time or PTO if it's separate from your sick leave for requested time off. So if you're one of those people who have reached out and said employees keep requesting time off and they're not submitting for vacation time, you have a right to require that they do. And if they don't, well, disciplinary action should likely occur, but we can talk about it. You don't have to have an unpaid time off policy. If an employee has used all their accrued PTO and there are no extenuating circumstances, additional absences may be considered unexcused. And is there a certain time of year where you don't really want your employees to take time off? Well, you have the right to implement blackout dates if that is the case. All right, so as always, we covered a lot today, and we are here to help. We are here to support you. Thank you for coming to our webinar. We do them every other week at the same time. Next week, or in 2 weeks, I keep saying next week, we're gonna be covering bonus and incentives, I believe. So definitely join us for that. But remember that we can help you keep up to date with all these state and federal policies and laws. We can help create policies. We can provide you templates as part of our packages and help update your employee handbook, review your current policies, of course, keep up with the changing laws and help with any forms, policies, and more. Our packages include access to a learning management system, which has a broad array of employee and manager e-learnings, including state compliant harassment prevention training. So you can check both of those boxes off. All right, now let's see what questions came in. Great question. Where can we find laws for our specific state? So generally your state website or regulatory agency will have the law. So definitely you can go to your, so in California, I know it's like the Department of Industrial Relations websites or whatever state you operate in, check the state website. You can also, the internet is your friend, so you can also look it up. There are some reputable companies out there who post articles on these regulations, and you can always reach out to our team and we can direct you as well. Let's see, if you have an unlimited PTO policy and you have employees in California and New York, do I need a max PTO cap to avoid large payout if employees leave? Ooh, I love this question, and that brings us to something I actually totally forgot to mention, so thank you for asking. If you have an unlimited PTO policy, generally, and this is part of why it's important that they're written by an attorney, but generally it's written in a way that doesn't allot a certain amount of time for each employee. Once you do that, it's truly not unlimited, right? Once you say we have an unlimited policy, but everyone can only take 2 weeks a year, that's contradictory. So if you have a true unlimited policy, you don't have to actually pay out generally at all. And the reason being is the PTO isn't assigned to one individual employee. Instead, it's a company benefit you are offering to everybody. So that is a great question. Just make sure it's written correctly and you won't have to worry about that large payout. Next question, can PTO be standardized for all employees within a class, or do employees receive their own pay rate? So I feel like there's 2 parts to this. I'm going to answer both, and if you still have a follow-up, definitely feel free to chime in. So you can decide that full-time employees or exempt or non-exempt employees get different amounts of PTO. That is absolutely something you can do as long as you're consistent and it's in writing. But when the actual time off that they are paid for, like the hourly rate, should be based on their regular rate of pay. So that will likely differ. Even if you say all full-time employees get 2 weeks, obviously people are at different pay rates, so they'll get paid different amounts. I hope that answers your question. Is there a method to track PTO within the pay entry software? Yes, there is. So we have a timekeeping system here at Pay Entry. So if you have never heard of it, it is different than your payroll system, where employees can actually submit for time off within that, and then that can communicate to the time card. So great question. Thank you for asking that. And one thing I didn't mention either today was that there are some wage statement requirements when it comes to PTO and sick leave and whatnot, depending on your state. So definitely make sure you work with your HR advisor or professional to make sure you are set up correctly there. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions coming in. Thank you all so much for your participation and for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and end the webinar now, but definitely come back in 2 weeks so we can talk about some incentives in this ever-changing work environment.